Hello, everyone. It's funny that, like every conversation in Michigan starts with some comments about the weather, but it forces us to do that. Like we all had a pretty, mild winter this time around, but then whenever we have speakers flying from California, it seems like that, Michigan just wants to give some authentic experience of Michigan winter here, and we have some warning around a coming ice storm. So I'm really glad that you guys are here. Thank you so much. And I know that a lot of people kind of signed up on Zoom. I'm really happy to introduce Erica Vogel here as a speaker, talking about her book that came out in 2020 by University of California Press. Erica Vogel is a professor of anthropology at Saddleback College in Southern California. She's a cultural anthropologist interested in issues of globalization, migration, religion, and transnational flows between Asia and Latin America. I came to know about her book because several colleagues that I deeply respect brought up her dissertation project whenever we had some casual conversation. So I became really interested in the project, and when I finally got my hand on her book, it was not disappointing, and I really wanted to share the book more broadly with Korean studies community and also Latin American studies community here on our campus. So thank you, Erica, so much for coming all the way from Southern California here. She's going to talk about her book titled Migrant Conversions, Transforming Connections Between Peru and South Korea.
Thank you very much. To Professor Jae-Yoon Kim, thank you, and to the NAM Center for Korean Studies for inviting me, and for everybody for coming out today and showing up on Zoom. I keep getting warnings on my phone, like, emergency, weather emergency, so it's pretty exciting. It's an honor to be here, and my book came out on March 10th, 2020, which was the day before my college shut down, and then much of the world shut down because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think that you'll agree that experiencing such a sudden change to our daily lives on a global scale, and the vulnerable feeling of not knowing if things would ever return to normal was surreal. But then here we are today, and it's sort of normal, but it's not exactly back to normal yet. And I start with that because it offers an interesting parallel to a time when the world suddenly flipped upside down, which was 2008's global financial crisis. So that event provides the backdrop to much of my book, which follows a group of Peruvian migrant workers, many of whom were undocumented, as they're forced to deal with the end of their residence in South Korea and develop strategies to transform themselves from economic migrants into the heads of successful transnational families, influential church leaders, and cosmopolitan travelers, all while dealing with various forms of uncertainty. So to remind everybody what that global financial crisis was like, here's a graph that has the Korean won to US dollar conversion rate. And I have it laid over my fieldwork trips to Peru and South Korea. So starting in 2006, I did a total of 24 months of ethnographic fieldwork spread out over 7 trips. And while I was there, I worked with current and former migrants, their families and church leaders, as well as with members of the Korean and Peruvian governments dealing with migrants. So during my preliminary research trips, does this have like a pointer? Yeah, okay. During the preliminary research trips, the conversion rate was pretty steady. So about 1 million won, which was the average salary of an undocumented migrant worker, it equaled about $1,000, give or take. Okay, and then people could send almost all of that money home because of they were able to live in their factory and they got some food. So it was a really pretty good deal, and $1,000 went a long way. And then during that time in my field notes here, people are talking a lot about legality. So they were trying to find ways to remain in Korea undetected, even though they had been excluded from the employee permit system, which was a guest worker system based on nationality that Peru hadn't been invited to participate in. So the ones who were remaining there were really their levels of surveillance had increased, and so it was really much more difficult, but they still had kind of hope of being included. Basically, nobody had said, no, you can't join, but they were just constantly hoping that they could join. So I thought that was going to be the subject of my study, like how did they get there and how are they dealing with trying to become documented. But when I came back from my main fieldwork, which is here, basically everything had changed, right? At this point, people, all that they were talking about was the value of the US dollar. The global financial crisis, which had originated in the US, had spread. The global economy was in flux. The conversion rate plummeted and then fluctuated wildly. So that meant that the monthly salary converted and sent home was sometimes worth 44% less than it had been the month before, but the expenses in Peru stayed the same. Also, this plunging figure meant that there were fewer jobs to be had. Whole factories were closing, or it was just much more difficult to get a job as an undocumented migrant because the government was enforcing a fine of 20 million won per person who was caught unemployed as an undocumented worker. People I knew were detained and deported while working, shopping, waiting for the bus, or even relaxing at home. So some people I knew kept their stuff packed at all times just in case they were picked up on their way home. So this was a person who showed me his house before church one day, and he was giving me the tour, and I was like, oh, what do you have in those boxes? Because they were packed up and taped up. And he said that was all his best stuff. Like at that point, it was like CDs and stuff from Dongdaemun, but he also had like new shoes and clothes and stuff. And it was addressed to his mother's house in Peru, and then his friends had instructions that if he were to be picked up and deported, that they could take that to the post office and send it home. So people knew that their time the end was near, but they were just trying to make the most of their time left. So that brought into relief questions that were obscured during more stable times. And I started to ask, how do people change the ways they understand their positions as migrants, plan for the future, and help their families in a time when everything's uncertain, including the value of the US dollar? How does their legal exclusion inspire them to carve out new spaces of belonging and opportunities for migration through church or friend networks? And in what ways do these efforts forge and change transnational connections between South Korea and Peru and help us see globalization happening in real time? So I'm going to give a brief example of what I mean by these questions through the story of Franco, who was an undocumented man from a city outside of Lima. And one afternoon, he showed me where he worked. I got this picture from the internet, but it pretty much looks like this. It's a college town, lots of people walking around, shops and restaurants. And then I was like, well, where do you work? And he showed me it was like a little space between, like, if you can imagine, like next to the coffee bean. He had set up a little table and he put his display case there with accesorios, which are like little accessories, little jewelry, or cell phone charms that he would sell. And then in this place, he wasn't really trying to avoid immigration officers. He were trying to avoid police officers who were trying to get anybody out who wasn't supposed to be selling there. So we sat down and did an interview because I had met him in 2009 in a World Missionary Convention at his church, which is called Nazarene. And he was participating at that time in a world missions event. And Nazarene is a giant mega church, Korean church, but it had a small Peruvian congregation. So I knew just from his participation in this event that he was really devoted because it was in the middle of the week. He was there from early morning until late at night. He had to pay to attend. It was something like $200. And he had to give up his earnings from selling accessories to be there. Later, when he sat down for an interview, like many Peruvians in Korea, when he told me his migration story, it was intertwined with details about the unstable value of the dollar and his experience of religious conversion in Korea. So he told me that although business was booming, he wasn't making any money. So I was like, what do you mean? And then he explained that actually this was his second time in Korea. So the first time he was in Korea, it was 1996, and you can see that his earning power was really strong then. the money he made, he got a job in a factory, he made money quickly, he saved $5,000 really easily, and then he decided to go back to Peru. He thought he'd made it, but he said he spent it just as easily. And he learned that, quote, money without a direction is a curse. So so I guess basically he described it as having partied the money away, just, drinking and taking his friends out. So then the Asian financial crisis happened, and then it kind of returned up here. He was able to come back on a different kind of visa. And when he came back this time, the situation was totally different. He wasn't able to get a factory job. The conversion rate was unsteady and much less. Then the global financial crisis hit, and by the time I was talking to him, it had never gone back up to the normal rate it was before. But more importantly, he was no longer the same person. On his first migration, he was a single man, but then on the second time, he was a father of a 2-year-old daughter who he had left in Peru with her mother. And he had a plan to stay a short time and save. Like, he was like, I'm going to do it like I did the first time, save $5,000 and then go back. But he wasn't able to do that. And then immediately, he found out that his daughter needed emergency heart surgery in Peru. And he was distraught and penniless. And he accompanied a friend to a Korean evangelical church that had a Spanish-speaking congregation for help. The Korean congregation helped him raise money for his daughter's surgery, so she's fine now. And then the Latin American congregation taught him the gospel, and that everything in his life, including his search for money, would be a failure until he accepted Jesus Christ in his heart, and then he converted. So over time in Korea, his goals had changed. He said it was actually good. He didn't have a steady job because it gave him more time to study, to be an evangelist. So at his church, a lot of people went to class all day long, took classes in their Korean church. And then I was curious what his family thought of this, because he had been sending remittances home to his parents, but also his brother and sister. Like, a lot of people were depending on him. And then, I said, how do they feel about it? And he said, oh, actually, they're really happy. And I was like, what do you mean? Tell me more. So he told me this. He said, all I did was give them the Evangelio, the gospel, and thank God, huge changes came to their lives. Years back, I sent money here and there, but the moment the money got there and they divided it up, nothing happened. This year, I began to give them the word of God, and wow, I saw that all of my siblings, all of my family began to change. I said nothing, only God just got here and you guys already want to change? Now I can send their propina, their pocket money, because I know what they're going to spend it on. So, this happened in my interview, and then I remember, like, months later, I went back. I was like, I'm going to listen to that again, because, and then it really stuck with me, this quote, because basically he was saying, he had sent money without social remittances of the gospel, and it had gone nowhere. But then when he coupled it, paired it with the gospel, just a tiny bit of money went farther. So in his, I didn't get a chance to interview his family about how they felt about it. I met a lot of people's families, but I didn't meet his. So it'd be interesting to hear their side. But in this case, I'd say that there probably is negligible, because the most important conversion was to Franco himself. Because through his various efforts to make money, to make his money go farther, by combining it with those social remittances, but also pursuing his own educational plans, and then helping his daughter, he changed from seeing himself as a victim of economic uncertainty and spiritual temptation to a spiritual and familiar leader who gives his family autonomy in an otherwise unstable situation. So as I write in the book, this is an ethnography of conversion and global plans, not only of converting from one religion to another, but of converting ends to beginnings, of converting unexpected migrations into predestined routes, and of converting impossibilities into previously unimaginable possibilities. And in the book, I demonstrate that much like Franco, through remitting money along with new values about work and religion, migrants attempt to convert themselves and their families into people who have greater access to global networks. And I use the frame of conversion as a way to explore people's complex migration motivations beyond economic gain, and how they and their worlds change as a result of their migrations and relationships. And then in particular, I explore the intersections of 3 types of conversions migrants make: to money, religious belief, and cosmopolitan plans, to argue that conversions are the ways migrants negotiate the meaning of their lives in a constantly changing context of place, status, and relationships, and continue to make meaningful impacts on the world even when their money has run out. So I'll explain what I mean by those conversions more in a second, but at this point you're probably wondering what Peruvians were doing in South Korea in the first place, and how I met them. So here's a map that I made for first my dissertation and the book, trying to understand kind of the global configuration according to my interviewees, or how they saw the world as being organized and what places they saw as being open to them for migration. So first of all, it's important to note that Korea is not a well-known sending destination for Peru in general. Like if you asked just an average Peruvian probably wouldn't know about Korea or that there was a community there, but they would say something like, there's Peruvians all over the world. Like it doesn't surprise me because unlike Mexico, where there's usually one destination, primarily people go to the United States, Peruvian migration is known to be scattered. So people go all over the place to like 25 main destinations. So Peruvians first arrived in Korea in 1995 in large numbers in hopes of eventually making it to where they would have rather gone, which was Japan. Okay, so Japan's up here, Italy and Spain and the United States, those are the most prestigious destinations, probably the most earning potential at this time. People hoped that if they went to Japan, if they went to South Korea, they could eventually make it to Japan, or they could have some kind of similar situation. It could turn into that kind of situation for them. So at the time, there was a wave of out-migration from Peru. People were escaping a failed economy and violent resistance movements. People who had money or had visas to the US, they went there, right? Or if you had family connections to Japan or to Italy or Spain, that's where they went. And then the people that I'm working with were kind of the next generation. They were like, these places in the world are there, but they're not really open to me. And then there were other places people could go, like Argentina, Venezuela, Chile, that were more local, but the earning potential was much lower. And so some people did go there before they went to Korea, or they went there afterwards, but it wasn't that kind of prestige that going so much farther away offered. The people that I interviewed who had been in Korea the longest, they either first arrived because they heard about it through a family member who was working in Japan at a factory with Korean people, and then they told them, oh, you should try Korea. Or there were people who were dishonest brokers who themselves had been working in Japan, they heard about Korea, they went there, and then they would go to Peru and they would advertise, like if you pay me a lot of money, like thousands of dollars, I'll get you a job, I'll get you a place to stay, which were all not true. They were lies, but they would bring them to South Korea, and if they were able to enter, because South Korea and Peru have a visa waiver agreement, so if you go and present yourself successfully as a tourist, you can be let in and given a 3-month visa without having to apply for one beforehand. If they were let in, they would then just abandon them. That happened a lot of times. But over time, people found jobs in Korea, outside of Seoul, and then they started to stay. So Korea was able to import labor in big numbers for the first time. They had, after the 1988 Seoul Olympics, the South Korea's economy improved, and they stopped exporting labor and started importing labor. The Peruvian community grew through chain migration, and there were a lot of other migrant workers there too. By far the largest groups were Han Chinese and ethnically Korean Chinese, but there were people from 54 different countries working in the factories, Jamaica, other parts of Latin America. I met people from Bolivia, Ecuador, Mexico, but Peru was by far the largest group of Latin American migrants. So they started to establish a community. They had soccer tournaments, Peruvian restaurants, Latin nightclubs. There were both Catholic and Protestant churches with Peruvian members, giant, like pretty big congregations. And then at the peak, there were an estimated 4,000 people, 4,000 Peruvians in Korea. Those estimates are from the Catholic Church. And then some of them were given a temporary visa through this amnesty program that was put into place to try to figure out how many undocumented workers were in South Korea. But in doing so, they had to register where they worked and where they lived. And so if they opted not to leave when that ended, then it was kind of easy to go find out where they were and pick them up and deport them. So when the EPS was implemented in 2004 and the surveillance increased, the numbers went down to 2,000. That's also an estimate from the Catholic Church. The official numbers are lower if you look at like the embassy's numbers are much lower. Okay, so it became increasingly dangerous to live there. They faced multiple forms of exclusion. And in fact, one of my very first visits to an interviewee's home near their factory, we had a few people in this little house. It was at night. And then everybody started getting calls on their phones. And they said, immigration is in the area near your house. And they said, hide or run. And then I was like, what are we going to do? And they said, oh, well, they're very calm, like, we'll just turn the lights out if they come by. And so that made me realize a few things. One is that danger was just a daily part of life that you just had to deal with if you were going to stay there, but also that there was very little protecting them. It was just darkness at this point was the thing that was protecting them. But that night they didn't come. The immigration didn't come, and they were like, let's continue with the interview, So what made them stay there? Given these conditions, what made it desirable? Well, the jobs were good. They liked the jobs. Like I mentioned earlier, it was a liquid salary, so you could live rent-free on the factory grounds. Most people did, but some people lived in apartments nearby. But they lived in converted shipping containers. And I heard mixed reviews on the life in a shipping container. Usually, if it was just one person living in there or a couple, then they had a nice time. Like I was able to spend the night at my friend's shipping container, and her husband worked in a recycling plant. So he was able to pick out all the good stuff from the recycling plant. Like they had an air conditioner. They had a 4-poster bed with like a princess thing on it. And it was lovely in there, but this one was not very lovely. This had 7 men living in there. They were all documented, the ones who lived in this place. Through the EPS system, but it was really hot and kind of broken furniture. So, it depends what the situation was, but you also got free food, and they paid even for the propane, for cooking and stuff. So the money that you made, and you didn't have to pay for transportation like people who worked in the United States or in Japan. They also liked it because both men and women could get jobs in the same place. So couples could work in a same factory. They paid a little bit less for women than men for doing the same job, which angered the women. But and then they had jobs like was a metal parts factory, but people worked making cardboard boxes or putting together little plastic stationery kind of things, or in the more heavy jobs that were dangerous were working in factories that created fabric, like for jeans, because it was really heavy and you had to carry the wet fabric. All right, or if they didn't work in a factory, they could sell, these are like the accesorios, and some people had wholesale businesses, and they would sell to other Peruvians, and then people would come by and pick some and then go out and sell them on the street at night. But they had a very nice community as well, both of people from Latin America in their churches, and also the nightclubs, but also people from all over the world. So this was like an Easter celebration. This is a Peruvian restaurant with drying chili peppers out front, which I love that picture. But that restaurant isn't there anymore, but that was in Dongduchan. And then this is me a few years ago, but with some friends, Peruvian ladies who were married to Korean men. So in these spaces, they were kind of set apart as being special because they were Peruvian, which was an unusual nationality to have in Korea. So it made them interesting and special. They got a special seat at the churches. A lot of churches I went to, they'd have some things up in Korean, in English, and in Spanish. And it was like, look how cosmopolitan we are. It added to the cachet of the church. Many of the churches by this time, Protestant churches had run out of Korean converts, and so they turned to migrant workers, and then both for local conversion, but also for launching missions abroad. So the Peruvians really came in right at a good time. So while they were excluded in other spaces, because of their nationality, like they didn't even have any chance to be documented. Within these spaces, that exclusion made them exciting, made them more included, okay? And then also, even though it was dangerous on a day-to-day basis, they found it safer than Peru in terms of like violent crimes were very rare. They could walk around at night. So they liked it, and they found that it made the risk worth it. So this makes more sense when we look at the 3 specific types of conversion that I refer to. Monetary conversion, and by this I mean that while Peruvian migrants in more mainstream destinations like the US and Japan, they can earn and remit their currency they can earn and remit their money in the same currency. So they make it in US dollars and they send it home in US dollars and they can put it in the bank. Same with yen, because Japanese migration is so popular and common. But with the won, they have to convert the won to dollars before they can send it home. So as people send money home, they always lose something. You lose at least either a little or a lot in that conversion, and it's also difficult to get it home. So, but at the same time as they send money home, it gains meaning and status depending on its context of exchange. So, if it's coming from somewhere prestigious, it gains more value. They gain value as a person, as a remitter for sending it. And then, like for religious conversion, like Franco, a significant number of Peruvians converted religions while in Korea. They mostly arrived as non-practicing Catholics or Protestants, and then they became active participants in a Korean church or switched between those 2 religions. And this happened for a few reasons. One, that was, besides the darkness, the church was the other kind of form of protection. You could get access to things that the people in the church would know more reliable information about what's going on with migration or the law. They had connections to help you find a job or to find a place to stay. But also it was more exciting to join a church in Korea than it was in Latin America, because some of the people that joined the Protestant churches in Korea, they suddenly became scholars. Like they were given scholarships to go study back in Peru to become a pastor. They changed their profession. Literally, their dreams of travel would come true. Whereas if you join in Peru, the stakes are much lower. So a lot of people, when they did go back, they didn't continue going to church, not because they didn't believe, but because they didn't find that community that they had found in Korea. And then I look at conversion as a journey. So like Diane Austin Bruce writes, it's like a reorientation, learning to see the world in a new way, including their past actions. So after converting, some Protestants saw their arrival in Korea as a respuesta, or an answer from God, and part of a larger mission to save Latin America. With cosmopolitan conversions, I'm talking about various creative projects or plans that Peruvians developed in Korea in the effort to help them change their lives and those of their families. So these plans sometimes required great sacrifices of time and money to reach fruition. So sometimes, for example, one person that I met, he was traveling every 3 months. He would leave to keep his visa valid, and then because he was hoping to eventually travel somewhere else, to get a permanent residency somewhere else. So if he became undocumented in Korea, that would look badly, but he needed time for that to happen, and he needed money. So these plans were so long, you needed all these factors to work together to have these plans work. They were developing businesses, they were trying to pursue an education for themselves or their children, and so I saw these plans as being cosmopolitan because they were about people wanting to gain the skills to, quote, feel at home in the world, but they also wanted to be recognized by others as being worthy of these new skills and statuses. So I'm going to give you an example of how these forms of conversion work together through the story of Camila, who is a 23-year-old woman I met in 2007 when she was working in Korea. She's part of a large mixed status family. She had, some of the members were in Japan, some siblings were in Korea, some were married to Koreans. She was undocumented. I met her at her church, which was a local church called Friendship Foreign Ministry. She was very charismatic, and she was excited to help me with my project. She wanted to show me where she sold accesorios after work on the street. She joked around easily in Korean with potential customers and shopkeepers. She had a boyfriend who she loved. He was Peruvian, but she'd met him in Korea. She was younger than many in the group, and then she asked me to visit her family in Peru because I was going there the following month. Oh yeah, this is just, I'll show you, yeah. So this is actually where her family lives in what's called a pueblo joven, like a new village. Was started out as squatter settlement and then became, more built up, the infrastructure built up. So when I got to Peru, I called her family. I knew they lived in a pueblo joven, and they hung up on me when they heard my accent, which says something about my Spanish accent. But they said that they reassured me that I didn't sound American, which I took as a compliment. But they said I sounded like Colombian or French or something, and then it was just a triggered scam to them because there's a lot of migration scams going around. So I let her know what happened. I emailed her, and then she called them, and then they called me, and they welcomed me. They were very kind. Her family lived in a place that looked a little bit like this, but it was developing, and it had a lot of recent improvements. There were some dirt roads, but also freshly poured cement sidewalks. And her shop fit very nicely in this because it was kind of, the house was a little bit older that was owned by her mom, but then her shop was new and it was out front on the first floor. And then immediately as I arrived, I realized two things. First was I had met Camila at this Protestant church, and I hadn't talked about her family's religious beliefs, but I immediately realized that her family was very Catholic and that she was Protestant. She had converted in Korea. And that this conversion, the new worldview, was causing some transnational tension between her and her mother, which was culminating around how they envisioned running Camila's store. So basically, her mom wanted to sell beer, and Camila didn't. Okay? I had been introduced to the family as Camila's friend from church, which is probably why her sister seemed embarrassed by the numerous customers coming up to buy beer. So while we were just standing out front, and she was showing me the store, and every 5 minutes or something, somebody would come and buy a big case of beer, and then her sister was got more and more I know that you don't, I know. She thought that I was against drinking alcohol, which is a common belief of the members of her church, that not only did they against drinking, but they really believed that it was contributing to the destruction of the family and of all of Latin America, that was really a big contributing factor. And so to have them selling beer right there was just a point of tension, right? But her mom seemed infuriated by this argument, and she almost kind of yelled, "If we don't sell beer, we might as well close down." She shouted from the inside of the store. And then they showed me the other businesses that Camila was sending remittances to construct, which was an internet cafe in the front room. And there were signs on the walls that said things like no swearing or no looking at pornography. And they told me they were willing to comply with those rules, but her mother flatly refused to stop selling beer. So, and then also before I left, she asked me to bring her a picture of the Virgin of Guadalupe from the Basilica, which is a very holy site, Catholic site in Mexico City, where my mother-in-law lives very close by. So I was like, okay, but don't tell Camila, But then when I got there, when I returned, I had the picture in hand, but I called her, and Camila answered. She was home. She had returned, and she was okay with me bringing the picture. But she explained that she hadn't been deported, but she had left on her own when she found out she was pregnant with her first child. She decided it would have been too difficult to raise an undocumented child in Korea. She was living with her mother and son in Lima until her boyfriend could save up enough money in Korea to build them a house. And she invited me to her birthday lunch with her family and her soon-to-be in-laws, who were also Protestants, at a nearby restaurant. And then I immediately noted that she and her mother had seemed to switch temperaments. She looked miserable throughout the lunch. The normally excited Camila looked very sad. And it was made even worse when her sister ordered pitchers of sangria, which have alcohol in them, for the whole table. And then it was exacerbated when her mom, it was a long table with the in-laws at one end. She looked down and she saw that the in-laws weren't drinking theirs. So she was like, "Can you send yours down here? I'll drink your sangria." And Camila started to kind of shrink into the table. And then when I talked to her later, she described a difficult transition where she wanted to continue living the way she had learned in her church in Korea, but her family flatly refused to comply. And her efforts to help her family and negotiate with her mother illustrates the interaction of three types of conversion, and also addresses the ways that any attempt at converting something also includes a risk for loss. So with money conversion, since Camila was no longer a migrant sending economic and social remittances from abroad, she no longer seemed to have much of a voice in defending her position, even at her own birthday party. She had converted in Korea, but now that she was in Peru, it was proving difficult to live her life the way she wanted, let alone persuade her family to change their lifestyles. For religious conversion, she had converted religious in Korea. She learned a new worldview and was very sincere about it. And she became emotional telling me about how she was not able to live and raise her son in the way she thought was correct. And this was notable to me because many people were suspicious of migrants who converted in Korea because they accused them of doing it for utilitarian reasons. And I could see that. In this case, it was really the opposite. Like, she was losing things by kind of sticking to her guns in terms of the way she wanted to live. In terms of cosmopolitan conversions, before departing Korea, she had various plans to become a business owner, to be self-sufficient, to help her community and family in Peru to be better people. She wanted to be part of a romantic relationship and develop herself as a respected member of her church community. And then these last two may have conflicted because later, when I went to Korea, I met her boyfriend and we chatted, and then he mentioned that because they'd had the baby before getting married, that had basically ended his future as a church leader within that Korean church. So her story is one example of how conversions were a way for migrants to negotiate their place in the world and to influence how other people saw them. But once Camila had left Korea, the value systems between her worlds in Korea and Peru diverged, and she couldn't get her family to see the world from her perspective because without the economic remittances and her position in Korea, she no longer had as much negotiation power over the family. Looking at these three forms of conversion shows the relational impact various global and transnational networks have on one another. When viewed in isolation, a migrant's choice to remain in a destination that's unprofitable and potentially dangerous might seem irrational. However, when those choices are placed in a larger perspective that includes global, transnational, and individual connections like global capitalism, Protestant and Catholic networks, and local and family histories, those choices start to make sense and clarify both individual migrant motivations and how globalization works. And then looking at conversion as a transnational journey reveals how globalization and being an active part in global processes continues to affect people's lives and ideas about their futures and their pasts long after they've stopped moving or once that particular global convergence has come to an end. And I found that when I would interview people who had been former migrant workers, the things that they talked about that they missed was that feeling of community and that global space and being out in the world together. And that includes Jeremy, who's I'm going to talk about him very briefly at the end here. He was a Peruvian man who had lived in Korea for 17 years. He had become a really important leader in his church. I thought he was planning to become a missionary. He was being supported by the church. He had also worked in the same factory nearly the whole time that he'd been there. He started as a young man, and he had kind of grown older in Korea. And then I was surprised one day to see him on social media that he was in Lima at the airport, and he didn't look happy. He was with his family. So a few weeks later, I emailed him and asked him if I could interview him and talk about it. And he said, quote, "The way I returned made me very embarrassed." And I asked him to clarify that. I was wondering if he meant he hadn't saved enough money while he was gone, which is a common thing, or was he treated badly by Peruvian immigration? And he said, no, it was how I was taken away in handcuffs in front of his friends. So he was one who had been detained while he was on his day off, and he was relaxing in the container. And then they came in to do like a random check and picked him up and handcuffed him in front of the whole factory. And he saw that as an insult and a misrecognition of his value and the status that he had accumulated during his time there. he said he was a hard worker, he had helped Korea, and that he wanted to go back to Korea, not to work again, but to say goodbye the right way, like with dignity. So I presented these three people's stories today, but none of them were simple conversions. For Franco, Camila, and Jeremy, all of their journeys involved negotiating emerging forms of loss and gain with multiple actors in a constantly changing context of configurations across time and space. And the projects are about converting the self and others and things, such as currency and nations. And no matter the setbacks, conversions cannot fail because any barriers are chances to find new opportunities, and any losses are chances to attempt more creative conversions. And for example, later I learned that Camila actually made it back to Korea, and Jeremy embarked on a second migration to Chile, and then he used the skills that he had gained into Korea, not to become a pastor, but to become a documented teacher there. So he has a professional job. And he actually told me that he could have found a job in Peru, even though it was really hard, and he was much older now, so it was harder, but that he wanted that global feel, and Chile had that for him. So their ongoing journeys apart from this book also highlight the ways that what accounts for a successful migration and the lasting impact of global moment like the financial crisis or the pandemic depends on how we frame the story as ethnographers, as scholars, and how the unfolding future begins to help us inform the past. Thank you.